Seth Sun Valana, truthless of Shinovar, wore white on the day he was to kill a king. The white clothing was a parshendi tradition, foreign to him, but he did as his masters required and did not ask for an explanation. He sat in a large stone room, baked by enormous fire pits that cast a garish light upon the revelers, causing beads of sweat to form on their skin as they danced, and drank, and yelled, and sang, and clapped. Some fell to the ground red-faced, the revelry too much for them, their stomachs proving to be inferior wineskins. They looked as if they were dead, at least until their friends carried them out of the feast hall to waiting beds. Seth did not sway to the drums, drink the sapphire wine, or stand to dance. He stood on a bench at the back, a still servant in white robes. Few at the treaty signing celebration noticed him. He was just a servant, and Shin were easy to ignore. Most out here in the east thought Seth's kind were docile and harmless. They were generally right. The drummers began a new rhythm. The beat shook Seth like a quartet of thumping hearts, pumping waves of invisible blood through the room. Seth's masters, who were dismissed as savages by those in more civilized kingdoms, sat at their own tables. They were men with skin of black marbled and red. Parshendi, they were named, cousins to the more docile servant peoples known as parshmen in most of the world. An oddity. They did not call themselves parshendi. This was the Alethi name for them. It meant, roughly, parshmen who can think. Neither side seemed to see that as an insult. The parshendi had brought the musicians. At first, the Alethi light eyes had been hesitant. To them, drums were bass instruments of the common, dark-eyed people, but wine was the great assassin of both tradition and propriety. And now the Alethi elite danced with abandon. Seth stood and began to pick his way through the room. The revelry had lasted long. Even the king had retired hours ago, but many still celebrated. As he walked, Seth was forced to step around Dalinar Kholin, the king's own brother, who slumped drunken at a small table. The aging but powerfully built man kept waving away those who tried to encourage him to bed. Where was Yasna, the king's daughter? Elhokar, the king's son and heir, sat at the high table, ruling the feast in his father's absence. He was in conversation with two men, a dark-skinned Azish man who had an odd patch of pale skin on his cheek, and a thinner, Alethi-looking man who kept glancing over his shoulder. The heir's feasting companions were unimportant. Seth stayed far from the heir, skirting the sides of the room, passing the drummers. Music spren zipped through the air around them, the tiny spirits taking the form of spinning translucent ribbons. As Seth passed the drummers, they noted him. They would withdraw soon, along with all the other parshendi. They did not seem offended. They did not seem angry. And yet they were going to break their treaty of only a few hours. It made no sense. But Seth did not ask questions. At the edge of the room, he passed rows of unwavering azure lights that bulged out where wall met floor. They held sapphires infused with stormlight. Profane. How could the men of these lands use something so sacred for mere illumination? Worse, the Alethi scholars were said to be close to creating new shardblades. Seth hoped that was just wishful boasting, for if it did happen, the world would be changed. Likely in a way that ended with people in all countries, from distant Tylana to towering Jah-Keved, speaking Alethi to their children. They were a grand people, these Alethi. Even drunk, there was a natural nobility to them. Tall and well-made, the men dressed in dark silk coats that buttoned down the sides of the chest, and were elaborately embroidered in silver or gold. Each one looked a general on the field. The women were even more splendid. They wore grand silk dresses, tightly fitted, the bright colors a contrast to the dark tones favored by the men. The left sleeve of each dress was longer than the right one, covering the hand. Alethi had an odd sense of propriety. Their pure black hair was pinned up atop their heads, either in intricate weavings of braids or in loose piles. It was often woven with gold ribbons or ornaments, along with gems that glowed with stormlight. Beautiful. Profane, but beautiful. Seth left the feasting chamber behind. Just outside, he passed the doorway into the beggar's feast. It was an Alethi tradition, a room where some of the poorest men and women in the city were given a feast complementing that of the king and his guests. A man with a long gray and black beard slumped in the doorway, smiling foolishly, though whether from wine or a weak mind, Seth could not tell.
"Have you seen me?"
the man asked with slurred speech. He laughed, then began to speak in gibberish, reaching for a wineskin. So it was drink after all. Seth brushed by, continuing past a line of statues depicting the 10 heralds from ancient Voran theology. Jazerze, Ishi, Kalek, Telenlat. He counted off each one and realized there were only 9 here. One was conspicuously missing. Why had Shalash's statue been removed? King Gavilar was said to be very devout in his Voran worship. Too devout, by some people's standards. The hallway here curved to the right, running around the perimeter of the domed palace. They were on the king's floor, 2 levels up, surrounded by rock walls, ceiling, and floor. That was profane. Stone was not to be trod upon. But what was he to do? He was truthless. He did as his masters demanded. Today that included wearing white. Loose white trousers tied at the waist with a rope, and over them a flimsy shirt with long sleeves, open at the front. White clothing for a killer was a tradition among the parshendi. Although Seth had not asked, his masters had explained why. White to be bold. White to not blend into the night. White to give warning. For if you were going to assassinate a man, he was entitled to see you coming. Seth turned right, taking the hallway directly towards the king's chambers. Torches burned on the walls, their light unsatisfying to him, a meal of thin broth after a long fast. Tiny flame spren danced around them, like insects made solely of congealed light. The torches were useless to him. He reached for his pouch and the spheres it contained, but then hesitated when he saw more of the blue lights ahead. A pair of Stormlight lamps hanging on the wall, brilliant sapphires glowing at their hearts. Seth walked up to one of these, holding out his hand to cup it around the glass-shrouded gemstone.
"You there!"
a voice called in Alethi. There were 2 guards at the intersection. Double guard, for there were savages abroad in Kholinar this night. True, those savages were supposed to be allies now, but alliances can be shallow things indeed. This one wouldn't last the hour. Seth looked as the 2 guards approached. They carried spears. They weren't light eyes, and therefore forbidden the sword. Their painted red breastplates were ornate, however, as were their helms. They might be dark-eyed, but they were high-ranking citizens with honored positions in the royal guard. Stopping a few feet away, the guard at the front gestured with his spear.
"Go on now. This is no place for you."
He had a tan Alethi skin and a thin mustache that ran all the way around his mouth, becoming a beard at the bottom. Seth didn't move.
"Well, what are you waiting for?"
Seth breathed in deeply, drawing forth the Stormlight. It streamed into him, siphoned from the twin sapphire lamps on the walls, sucked in as if by his deep inhalation. The stormlight raged inside of him, and the hallway suddenly grew darker, falling into shade like a hilltop cut off from the sun by a transient cloud. Seth could feel the light's warmth, its fury, like a tempest that had been injected directly into his veins. The power of it was invigorating, but dangerous. It pushed him to act, to move, to strike. Holding his breath, he clung to the stormlight. He could still feel it leaking out. Stormlight could only be held for a short amount of time, a few minutes at most. It leaked away, the human body too porous in container. He had heard that the Voidbringers could hold it in perfectly. But then, did they even exist? His punishment declared that they didn't. His honor demanded that they did. Afire with holy energy, Seth turned to the guards. They could see that he was leaking stormlight, wisps of it curling from his skin like luminescent smoke. The lead guard squinted, frowning. Seth was sure the man had never seen anything like it before. As far as he knew, Seth had killed every stonewalker who had ever seen what he could do.
What? What are you?
The guard's voice lost its certainty.
Spirit or man?
What am I?
Seth whispered, a bit of light leaking from his lips as he looked past the man down the long hallway.
I'm sorry.
Seth blinked, lashing himself to the distant point down the hallway. Stormlight raged from him in a flash, chilling his skin, and the ground immediately stopped pulling him downward. Instead, he was pulled toward that distant point, as if, to him, that direction had suddenly become down. This was a basic lashing, first of his 3 kinds of lashings. It gave him the ability to manipulate whatever force, spren, or god it was that held men to the ground. With this lashing, he could bind people or objects to different surfaces or in different directions. From Seth's perspective, the hallway was now a deep shaft down which he was falling, and the 2 guards stood on one of the sides. They were shocked when Seth's feet hit them, one for each face, throwing them over. Seth shifted his view and lashed himself to the floor. Light leaked from him. The floor of the hallway again became down, and he landed between the 2 guards, clothes crackling and dropping flakes of frost. He rose, beginning the process of summoning his shardblade. One of the guards fumbled for his spear. Seth reached down, touching the soldier's shoulder while looking up. He focused on a point above him while willing the light out of his body and into the guard, lashing the poor man to the ceiling. The guard yelped in shock as up became down for him. Light trailing from his form, he crashed into the ceiling and dropped his spear. It was not lashed directly and clattered back down to the floor near Seth. To kill. It was one of the greatest of sins, and yet here Seth stood, truthless, profanely walking on stones used for building, and it would not end. As truthless, there was only one life he was forbidden to take, and that was his own. At the 10th beat of his heart, his shardblade dropped into his waiting hand. It formed as if condensing from mist, water beading along the middle length. His shardblade was long and thin, edged on both sides, smaller than most others. Seth swept it out, carving a line in the stone floor and passing through the 2nd guard's neck. As always, the shardblade killed oddly. Though it cut easily through stone, steel, or anything inanimate, the metal fuzzed when it touched living skin. It traveled through the guard's neck without leaving a mark, but once it did, the man's eyes smoked and burned. They blackened, shriveling up in his head, and he slumped forward, dead. The shardblade did not cut living flesh, it severed the soul itself. Above, the 1st guard gasped. He'd managed to get to his feet, even though they were planted on the ceiling of the hallway.
Shardbearer! The shardbearer assaults the king's hall! To arms!
Finally, Seth thought. Seth's use of the stormlight was unfamiliar to the guards, but they knew a shardblade when they saw one. Seth bent down and picked up the spear that had fallen from above. As he did so, he would release the breath he'd been holding on to since drawing in the Stormlight. It sustained him while he held it, but those 2 lanterns hadn't contained much of it, so he would need to breathe again soon. The light began to leak away more quickly, now that he wasn't holding his breath. Seth sent the spear's butt against the stone floor, then looked upward. The guard above stopped shouting, eyes opening wide as the tails of his shirt began to slip downward, the earth below reasserting its dominance. The light streaming off his body dwindled. He looked down at Seth, down at the spear tip pointing directly at his heart. Violet sphere spren crawled out of the stone ceiling around him. The light ran out. The guard fell. He screamed as he hit, the spear impaling him through the chest. Seth let the spear fall away, carried to the ground with a muffled thump by the body twitching on its end. Shardblade in hand, he turned down a side corridor, following the map he'd memorized. He ducked around a corner and flattened himself against the wall just as a troop of guards reached the dead man. The newcomers began shouting immediately, continuing the alarm. His instructions were clear. Kill the king, but be seen doing it. Let the Alethi know he was coming and what he was doing. Why? Why did the parshendi agree to this treaty, only to send an assassin the very night of its signing? More gemstones glowed on the walls of the hallway here. King Gavilar liked lavish display, and he couldn't know that he was leaving sources of power for Seth to use in his lashings. Things Seth did hadn't been seen for millennia. Histories from those times were all but non-existent, and the legends were horribly inaccurate. Seth peeked back out into the corridor. One of the guards at the intersection saw him, pointing and yelling. Seth made sure they got a good look, then ducked away. He took a deep breath as he ran, drawing in Stormlight from the lanterns. His body came alive with it, and his speed increased, his muscles bursting with energy. The light became a storm inside of him. His blood thundered in his ears. It was terrible and wonderful at the same time. 2 corridors down, one to the side. He threw open the door of a storage room, then hesitated a moment, just long enough for a guard to round the corner and see him, before dashing into the room. Preparing for a full lashing, he raised his arm and commanded the Stormlight to pool there, causing the skin to burst alight with radiance. Then he flung his hand out toward the doorframe, spraying white luminescence across it like paint. He slammed the door just as the guards arrived. The Stormlight held the door in the frame with the strength of 100 arms. A full lashing bound objects together, holding them fast until the Stormlight ran out. It took longer to create and drained Stormlight far more quickly than a basic lashing. The door handle shook, and the wood began to crack as the guards threw their weight against it, one man calling for an axe. Seth crossed the room in rapid strides, weaving around the shrouded furniture that had been stored here. It was of red cloth and deep, expensive woods. He reached the far wall and, preparing himself for yet another blasphemy, he raised his shardblade and slashed horizontally through the dark gray stone. The rock sliced easily. A shardblade could cut any inanimate object. 2 vertical slashes followed, then one across the bottom, cutting a large square block. He pressed his hand against it, willing Stormlight into the stone. Behind him, the room's door began to crack. He looked over his shoulder and focused on the shaking door, lashing the block in that direction. Frost crystallized on his clothing. Lashing something so large required a great deal of Stormlight. The tempest within him stilled, like a storm reduced to a drizzle. He stepped aside. The large stone block shuddered, sliding into the room. Normally, moving the block would have been impossible. Its own weight would have held it against the stones below. Yet now, that same weight pulled it free. For the block, the direction of the room's door was down, With a deep grinding sound, the block slid free of the wall and tumbled through the air, smashing furniture. The soldiers finally broke through the door, staggering into the room just as the enormous block crashed into them. Seth turned his back on the terrible sound of the screams, the splintering of wood, the breaking of bones. He ducked and stepped through his new hole, entering the hallway outside. He walked slowly, drawing stormlight from the lamps he passed, siphoning it to him and stoking anew the tempest within. As the lamps dimmed, the corridor darkened. A thick wooden door stood at the end, and he approached. Small fear-spren, shaped like globs of purple goo, began to wriggle from the masonry, pointing towards the doorway. They were drawn by the terror being felt on the other side. Seth pushed the door open, entering the last corridor leading to the king's chambers. Tall, red ceramic vases lined the pathway, and they were interspaced with nervous soldiers. They flanked a long, narrow rug. It was red, like a river of blood. The spearmen in front didn't wait for him to get close. They broke into a trot, lifting their short throwing spears. Seth slammed his hand to the side, pushing Stormlight into the doorframe, using the third and final type of lashing, a reverse lashing. This one worked differently from the other two. It did not make the doorframe emit Stormlight. Indeed, it seemed to pull nearby light into it, giving it a strange penumbra. The spearman threw, and Seth stood still, hand on the doorframe. A reverse lashing required his constant touch, but it took comparatively little stormlight. During one, anything that approached him, particularly lighter objects, was instead pulled towards the lashing itself. The spears veered in the air, splitting around him and slamming into the wooden frame. As he felt them hit, Seth leaped into the air and lashed himself to the right wall, his feet hitting the stone with a slap. He immediately reoriented his perspective. To his eyes, he wasn't standing on the wall, the soldiers were, and the blood-red carpet streaming between them like a long tapestry. Seth bolted down the hallway, striking with his shardblade, shearing through the necks of two men who had thrown spears at him. Their eyes burned, and they collapsed. The other guards in the hallway began to panic. Some tried to attack him. Others yelled for more help. Still others cringed away from him. The attackers had trouble. They were disoriented by the oddity of striking at someone who hung on the wall. Seth cut down a few, then flipped into the air, tucking into a roll, and lashed himself back to the floor. He hit the ground in the midst of the soldiers, completely surrounded, but holding a shardblade. According to legend, the shardblades were first carried by knights radiant uncounted ages ago, gifts of their god granted to allow them to fight horrors of rock and flame, dozens of feet tall, foes whose eyes burned with hatred, the Void Bringers. When your foe had skin as hard as stone itself, steel was useless. Something supernal was required. Seth rose from his crouch, loose white clothes rippling, jaw clenched against his sins. He struck out, his weapon flashing with reflected torchlight. Elegant, wide swings. 3 of them, one after another. He could neither close his ears to the screams that followed nor avoid seeing the men fall. They dropped around him like toys knocked over by a child's careless kick. If the blade touched a man's spine, he died, eyes burning. If it cut through the core of a limb, it killed that limb. One soldier stumbled away from Seth, arm flopping uselessly on his shoulder. He would never be able to feel or use it again. Seth lowered his shardblade, standing among the cinder-eyed corpses. Here, in Alethkar, men often spoke of the legends of mankind's hard-won victory over the Void Bringers. But when weapons created to fight nightmares were turned against common soldiers, the lives of men became cheap things indeed. Seth turned and continued on his way, slippered feet falling on the soft red rug. The shardblade, as always, glistened silver and clean. When one killed with a blade, there was no blood. That seemed like a sign. The shardblade was just a tool. It could not be blamed for the murders. The door at the end of the hallway burst open. Seth froze as a small group of soldiers rushed out, ushering a man in regal robes, his head ducked as if to avoid arrows. The soldiers wore deep blue, the color of the king's guard, and the corpses didn't make them stop and gawk. They were prepared for what a shardbearer could do. They opened a side door and shoved their ward through, several leveling spears at Seth as they backed out. Another figure stepped from the king's quarters. He wore glistening blue armor made of smoothly interlocking plates. Unlike common plate armor, however, this armor had no leather or mail visible at the joints, just smaller plates, fitting together with intricate precision. The armor was beautiful, the blue inlaid with golden bands around the edges of each piece of plate, the helm ornamented with 3 waves of small, horn-like wings. Shardplate, the customary complement to a shardblade. The newcomer carried a sword as well, an enormous shardblade 6 feet long with a design along the blade like burning flames, a weapon of silvery metal that gleamed and almost seemed to glow. A weapon designed to slay dark gods, a larger counterpart to the one Seth carried. Seth hesitated. He didn't recognize the armor. He had not been warned that he would be set at by this task, and he hadn't been given proper time to memorize the various suits of plate or blades owned by the Alethi. But a shardbearer would have to be dealt with before he chased the king. He could not leave such a foe behind. Besides, perhaps a shardbearer could defeat him, kill him, and end his miserable life. His lashings wouldn't work directly on someone in shardplate, and the armor would enhance the man, strengthening him. Seth's honor would not allow him to betray his mission or seek death, but if that death occurred, he would welcome it. The shardbearer struck, and Seth lashed himself to the side of the hallway, leaping with a twist and landing on the wall. He danced backward, blade held at the ready. The shardbearer fell into an aggressive posture, using one of the swordplay stances favored here in the East. He moved far more nimbly than one would expect for a man in such bulky armor. Shardplate was special, as ancient and magical as the blades it complemented. The shardbearer struck. Seth skipped to the side and lashed himself to the ceiling as the shardbearer's blade sliced into the wall. Feeling a thrill at the contest, Seth dashed forward and attacked downward with an overhead blow, trying to hit the shardbearer's helm. The man ducked, going down on one knee, letting Seth's blade cleave empty air. Seth leaped backward as the shardbearer swung upward with his blade, slicing into the ceiling. Seth didn't own a set of plate himself, and didn't care to. His lashings interfered with the gemstones that powered shardplate, and he had to choose one or the other. As the shardbearer turned, Seth sprinted forward across the ceiling. As expected, the shardbearer swung again, and Seth leaped to the side, rolling. He came up from his roll and flipped, lashing himself to the floor again. He spun to land on the ground behind the shardbearer. He slammed his blade into the opponent's open back. Unfortunately, there was one major advantage the plate offered. It could block a shardblade. Seth's weapon hit solidly, causing a web of glowing lines to spread out across the back of the armor, and Stormlight began to leak free from them. Shardplate didn't dent or bend like common metal. Seth would have to hit the shardbearer in the same location at least once more to break through. Seth danced out of range as the shardbearer swung in anger, trying to cut at Seth's knees. The tempest within Seth gave him many advantages, including the ability to quickly recover from small wounds, but it would not restore limbs killed by a shardblade. He rounded the shardbearer, then picked a moment and dashed forward. The shardbearer swung again, but Seth briefly lashed himself to the ceiling for lift. He shot into the air, cresting over the swing, then immediately lashed himself back to the floor. He struck as he landed, but the shardbearer recovered quickly and executed a perfect follow-through stroke, coming within a finger of hitting Seth. The man was dangerously skilled with that blade. Many shardbearers depended too much on the power of their weapon and armor. This man was different. Seth jumped to the wall and struck at the shardbearer with quick, terse attacks, like a snapping eel. The shardbearer fended him off with wide, sweeping counters. His blade's length kept Seth at bay.
This is taking too long,
Seth thought. If the king slipped away into hiding, Seth would fail in his mission no matter how many people he killed. He ducked in for another strike, but the shardbearer forced him back. Each second this fight lasted was another chance for the king to escape. It was time to be reckless. Seth launched into the air, lashing himself to the other end of the hallway and falling feet first toward his adversary. The shardbearer didn't hesitate to swing, but Seth lashed himself down at an angle, dropping immediately. The shardblade swished through the air above him. He landed in a crouch, using his momentum to throw himself forward, and swung at the shardbearer's side, where the plate had cracked. He hit with a powerful blow. That piece of the plate shattered, bits of molten metal streaking away. The shardbearer grunted, dropping to one knee, raising a hand to his side. Seth raised a foot to the man's side and shoved him backward with a Stormlight-enhanced kick. The heavy shardbearer crashed into the door of the king's quarters, smashing it and falling part way into the room beyond. Seth left him, ducking instead through the doorway to the right, following the way the king had gone. The hallway here had the same red carpet, and Stormlight lamps on the walls gave Seth a chance to recharge the tempest within. Energy blazed within him again, and he sped up. If he could get far enough ahead, he could deal with the king, then turn back to fight off the shardbearer. It wouldn't be easy. A full lashing on a doorway wouldn't stop a shardbearer, and that plate would let the man run supernaturally fast. Seth glanced over his shoulder. The shardbearer wasn't following. The man sat up in his armor, looking dazed. Seth could just barely see him, sitting in the doorway, surrounded by broken bits of wood. Perhaps Seth had wounded him more than he'd thought. Or maybe. Seth froze. He thought of the ducked head of the man who'd been rushed out, face obscured. The shardbearer still wasn't following. He was so skilled. It was said that few men could rival Gavilar Kholin's swordsmanship. Could it be? Seth turned and dashed back, trusting his instincts. As soon as the shardbearer saw him, he climbed to his feet with alacrity. Seth ran faster. What was the safest place for your king? In the hands of some guards fleeing? Or protected in a suit of shardblade, left behind, dismissed as a bodyguard? Clever, Seth thought as the formerly sluggish shardbearer fell into another battle stance. Seth attacked with renewed vigor, swinging his blade in a flurry of strikes. The shardbearer, the king, aggressively struck out with broad, sweeping blows. Seth pulled away from one of these, feeling the wind of the weapon passing just inches before him. He timed his next move, then dashed forward, ducking underneath the king's follow-through. The king, expecting another strike at his side, twisted with his arm held protectively to block the hole in his blade. That gave Seth the room to run past him and into the king's chambers. The king spun around to follow, but Seth ran through the lavishly furnished chamber, flinging out his hand, touching pieces of furniture he passed. He infused them with Stormlight, lashing them to a point behind the king. The furniture tumbled as if the room had been turned on its side, couches, chairs, and tables dropping towards the surprised king. Gavilar made the mistake of chopping at them with his shardblade. The weapon easily sheared through a large couch, but the pieces still crashed into him, making him stumble. A footstool hit him next, throwing him to the ground. Gavilar rolled out of the way of the furniture and charged forward. plate leaking streams of light from the cracked sections. Seth gathered himself, then leaped into the air, lashing himself backward and to the right as the king arrived. He zipped out of the way of the king's blow, then lashed himself forward with 2 basic lashings in a row. Stormlight flashed out of him, clothing freezing, as he was pulled toward the king at twice the speed of a normal fall. The king's posture indicated surprise as Seth lurched in midair, then spun towards him, swinging. He slammed his blade into the king's helm, then immediately lashed himself to the ceiling and fell upward, slamming into the stone roof above. He'd lashed himself in too many directions too quickly, and his body had lost track, making it difficult to land gracefully. He stumbled back to his feet. Below, the king stepped back, trying to get into position to swing up at Seth. The man's broken helm was cracked, leaking stormlight, and he stood protectively, defending the side with the broken plate. The king used a one-handed swing, reaching for the ceiling. Seth immediately lashed himself downward, judging that the king's attack would leave him unable to get his sword back in time. Seth underestimated his opponent. The king stepped into Seth's attack, trusting his helm to absorb the blow. Just as Seth hit the helm a second time, shattering it, Gavilar punched with his offhand, slamming his gauntleted fist into Seth's face. Blinding light flashed in Seth's eyes, a counterpoint to the sudden agony that crashed across his face. Everything blurred, his vision fading. Pain. So much pain. He screamed, Stormlight leaving him in a rush, and he slammed back into something hard. The balcony doors. More pain broke out across his shoulders, as if someone had stabbed him with 100 daggers, and he hit the ground and rolled to a stop, muscles trembling. The blow would have killed an ordinary man. No time for pain. No time for pain. No time for pain. He blinked, shaking his head, the world blurry and dark. Was he blind? No. It was dark outside. He was on the wooden balcony. The force of the blow had thrown him through the doors. Something was thumping. Heavy footfalls. The shardbearer. Seth stumbled to his feet, vision swimming. Blood streamed from the side of his face, and stormlight rose from his skin, blinding his left eye. The light. It would heal him, if it could. His jaw felt unhinged. Broken? He dropped his shardblade. A lumbering shadow moved in front of him. The shardbearer's armor had leaked enough stormlight that the king was having trouble walking, but he was coming. Seth screamed, kneeling, infusing stormlight into the wooden balcony, lashing it downward. The air frosted around him. The tempest roared, traveling down his arms into the wood. He lashed it downward, then did it again. He lashed a 4th time as Gavilar stepped onto the balcony. It lurched under the extra weight. The wood cracked, straining. The shardbearer hesitated. Seth lashed the balcony downward a 5th time. The balcony supports shattered, and the entire structure broke free from the building. Seth screamed through a broken jaw and used his final bit of stormlight to lash himself to the side of the building. He fell to the side, passing the shocked shardbearer, then hit the wall and rolled. The balcony dropped away, the king looking up with shock as he lost his footing. The fall was brief. In the moonlight, Seth watched solemnly, vision still fuzzy, blinded in one eye, as the structure crashed into the stone ground below. The wall of the palace trembled, and the crash of the broken wood echoed from the nearby buildings. Still standing on the side of the wall, Seth groaned, climbing to his feet. He felt weak. He'd used up his stormlight too quickly, straining his body. He stumbled down the side of the building, approaching the wreckage, barely able to remain standing. The king was still moving. Shardplate would protect a man from such a fall, but a large length of bloodied wood stuck up through Gavilar's side, piercing him where Seth had broken the plate earlier. Seth knelt down, inspecting the man's pain-wrecked face. Strong features, square chin, black beard flecked with white, striking pale green eyes. Gavilar Colin.
I expected you to come,
the king said between gasps. Seth reached underneath the front of the man's breastplate, tapping the straps there. They unfastened, and he pulled the front of the breastplate free, exposing the gemstones on its interior. 2 had been cracked and burned out. 3 still glowed. Numb, Seth breathed in sharply, absorbing the light. The storm began to rage again. More light rose from the side of his face, repairing his damaged skin and bones. The pain was still great. Stormlight healing is far from instantaneous. It would be hours before he recovered. The king coughed.
You can tell Thydakar that he is too late.
I don't know who that is,
Seth said, standing, his words slurring from his broken jaw. He held his hand to his side, resummoning his shardblade. The king frowned.
Then who? Ristares? Sadius? I never thought.
My masters are the parshendi,
Seth said. 10 heartbeats passed, and his blade dropped into his hand, wet with condensation.
The parshendi? That makes no sense.
Gavilar coughed, hand quivering, reaching towards his chest and fumbling at a pocket. He pulled out a small crystalline sphere tied to a chain.
You must take this. They must not get it.
He seemed dazed.
Tell my brother he must find the most important words a man can say.
Gavilar fell still. Seth hesitated, then knelt down and took the sphere. It was odd, unlike any he'd seen before. Though it was completely dark, it seemed to glow somehow, with a light that was black.
Parshendi?
Gavilar had said.
That makes no sense.
Nothing makes sense anymore,
Seth whispered, tucking the strange sphere away.
It's all unraveling. I am sorry, King of the Alethi. I doubt that you care. Not anymore, at least.
He stood up.
At least you won't have to watch the world ending with the rest of us.
Beside the king's body, his shardblade materialized from mist, clattering to the stones now that its master was dead. It was worth a fortune. Kingdoms had fallen as men vied to possess a single shardblade. Shouts of alarm came from inside the palace. Seth needed to go, but...
Tell my brother.
To Seth's people, a dying request was sacred. He took the king's hand, dipping it in the man's own blood, then used it to scrawl on the wood. Brother, you must find the most important words a man can say. With that, Seth escaped into the night. He left the king's shardblade. He had no use for it. The blade Seth already carried was curse enough.